Knowing the pattern isn't the same as breaking it. You can name the redirect, you can spot the label game happening in real time, you can watch the exact sequence play out step by step and still walk straight into it the next time, because knowing what a trap looks like and knowing how to actually disarm it are two completely different skills. Today, we're building the second one. This is Robbin, and this is the honest ledger. We've spent 2 videos naming this pattern: the redirect that turns a real concern into a referendum on your tone, and the label game that runs the exact same sequence across money, respect, and intimacy. Today isn't diagnosis. Today is the fix. A concrete system for actually interrupting this cycle the next time it starts, instead of just recognizing it after the fact. One thing needs to be said clearly, and I'll say it once. This is a framework built to work regardless of what's driving the pattern on the other side. You don't need her cooperation to start using it, and you don't need a theory about why it happens to make it work. What you need is a system applied consistently, starting with the next conversation. Let's open the ledger. The first entry in the ledger is catching the deflection at the earliest possible point, because the entire cycle depends on reaching your third attempt. The one where frustration finally shows in your voice and gives the conversation something else to redirect onto. The fix is to treat the first deflection as information, not as something to quietly try again around. The moment a real concern gets met with silence, a subject change, or a vague, "We'll talk later," name that directly, calmly, in the same conversation. I notice we're moving past this without actually answering it, and I need us to stay with it for a minute. You're not accusing anyone of manipulation. You're simply refusing to let the first test pass without comment, which removes the 2 additional attempts the entire mechanism is built to exploit. On the ledger, the redirect diffused before it has room to build momentum, because it was named at attempt 1 instead of survived until attempt 3. This single move does more work than almost anything else in this framework, because the entire mechanism depends on you staying quiet through the early tests. Break that dependency and the rest of the sequence often never gets the chance to start. The second entry is the specific ask framework, because vague conversations produce vague, forgettable outcomes that quietly evaporate once the discomfort of the moment passes. Every time you raise a concern, end it with a concrete, specific ask rather than a general statement of the problem. Not, "I don't like how the money's been going," but "I need us to agree on a number for discretionary spending this month, and I need to know what that number is by the end of this conversation." Not, "I feel disrespected in front of your family, but I need you to back me up if the kids question a decision I've made, starting with the next time we're together." A specific ask is much harder to deflect than a general grievance, because it requires an actual yes or no rather than an emotional reaction that can absorb the whole conversation. On the ledger, a request specific enough that dodging it is visible to both people in the room, instead of vague enough to disappear into. Specificity does something else too. It forces you to actually know what you want before you open the conversation, which means you walk in with a clear outcome in mind instead of just a feeling that something's wrong, and a clear outcome is much harder to talk you out of than a vague complaint. The third entry is running 2 tracks at once instead of 1, because this is exactly where most redirects succeed, by merging the tone conversation and the substance conversation into a single exchange, so that resolving one feels like it resolved both. The fix is to explicitly separate them out loud. If your voice did rise, if your tone genuinely was sharper than it needed to be, own that specifically and briefly. "You're right that I raised my voice, and I'm sorry for that." And then in the very next sentence, return to the actual issue without treating the apology as the end of the conversation. "And I still need us to agree on the budget number." 2 tracks, both acknowledged, neither one allowed to fully absorb the other. On the ledger, accountability given where it's actually owed, without it being used as currency to purchase silence on the issue that started the conversation. This is one of the harder skills in this whole framework to actually execute in the moment, because it requires staying calm enough mid-conflict to hold 2 separate threads at once. It gets easier with practice. The first few times will feel unnatural, and that's normal. The fourth entry is the pause protocol, because sometimes a conversation genuinely does need to cool down before it can be productive. The fix isn't to force every conversation through in one sitting, it's to make sure a pause is a bridge instead of an exit. The difference is a scheduled return. Let's take 20 minutes and come back to this at 8, is a pause. Walking away with no agreed time to return is how issues quietly die. Set the return time explicitly, out loud, before you separate, and hold to it. If the other person doesn't want to return to it at the agreed time, that itself becomes the new thing worth naming directly, rather than letting the postponement become permanent by default. On the ledger, a cooling off period that actually leads back to resolution, instead of one that functions as a slow, deniable way to make the issue disappear. The scheduled return time is doing almost all of the work here. Without it, a pause and a permanent drop are functionally indistinguishable until enough time has passed to prove which one it actually was. The fifth entry is setting the rule before you need it, because negotiating ground rules in the middle of a live conflict is far harder than agreeing to them in a calm moment beforehand. Pick a genuinely calm time, not during or right after a disagreement, and propose a simple standing agreement. Neither of you ends a real disagreement without either resolving it or scheduling a specific time to come back to it. Get actual agreement on that principle when nothing is at stake, so that invoking it later isn't a fresh negotiation every time, it's just enforcing something you both already signed on to. Picture the difference between saying, "We need a rule about this," in the heat of an argument, versus calmly referencing a rule you agreed to over dinner 2 months ago. The second version lands as fairness. The first version lands as another demand in the middle of a fight. On the ledger, a standing agreement banked in advance that does the work a live negotiation never could in the moment it's actually needed. This is worth treating as a real conversation in its own right, not a quick aside. Frame it as something you're proposing for both of you, a mutual commitment to never letting a real issue simply vanish, rather than a rule aimed specifically at her behavior. The sixth entry is using outside structure without treating it as a last resort or a failure. A lot of men wait until a relationship is in genuine crisis before considering counseling, treating it as an admission that something's gone badly wrong rather than what it actually is. A tool that gives a pattern like this a structured space to be interrupted with a neutral third party present. A therapist trained in this exact dynamic can name the redirect in real time, in a setting where it's much harder to run than it is at home, precisely because there's a witness whose entire job is to keep the conversation on the actual issue. Picture a man who's tried the specific ask framework and the two-track approach consistently for months with no real change. That's not evidence he failed at fixing it himself. It's evidence the pattern needs a structured environment to interrupt, which is exactly what counseling is built to provide. On the ledger, a tool used proactively, before total breakdown, instead of only after the relationship has already been running on fumes for years. The stigma around this move tends to hurt men specifically. The instinct is often to see needing outside help as a personal failure to fix things on your own, when in reality, it's simply recognizing which problems respond better to a neutral structure than to two people trying to solve an entrenched pattern alone. The seventh entry is knowing your actual threshold, stated as a real number rather than a vague feeling, because "I'll know it when I see it" tends to mean you never actually see it until you're already exhausted. Decide, honestly and in advance, what a genuine, sustained effort looks like for you. How many months of consistently applying this framework? How many real conversations? What specific change you're actually looking for? And hold yourself to that timeline rather than an indefinite one. This isn't about setting an ultimatum to control someone else's behavior. It's about knowing, for your own sake, the difference between "we're actively working on this" and "nothing is actually changing and I've stopped noticing." On the ledger, a real pre-decided threshold, which protects you from the kind of open-ended patience that quietly turns into years without you ever consciously choosing that outcome. Write the threshold down somewhere, literally, if that helps make it concrete. A standard that only exists in your head is remarkably easy to keep quietly renegotiating with yourself every time it's tested. The eighth entry is going first on the standard you want to see, not as self-blame, but as strategy, because the fastest way to make a specific ask, two-track conversation feel normal in your relationship is to demonstrate it yourself first, consistently, in the moments it's hardest to do. When you're the one who did something worth addressing, be the one who says, You're right, I hear it. Here's specifically what I'll do differently without adding a but onto the end of it. This isn't about taking on blame that isn't yours. It's about setting the actual bar for what accountable conversation looks like in your relationship, so that when you ask for the same standard in return, you're asking for something you've already demonstrated is possible, not something abstract you've only described. There's also a practical reason this works better than it might seem. People generally find it much harder to deflect a standard they've just watched modeled successfully than one they're hearing about for the first time as a demand. The ninth entry is building a reserve of goodwill outside of conflict entirely, because a couple with a strong positive balance between them handles hard conversations completely differently than a couple running on empty. Deliberately invest in the good, ordinary moments. Genuine appreciation, real attention, small, consistent gestures of warmth, not as leverage for the next disagreement, but because a relationship with a real reserve of trust and goodwill can actually absorb the friction of a hard conversation without it turning into a crisis. Picture the same specific ask conversation happening in two different relationships, one where the last month has been full of genuine warmth and one where resentment has been quietly building for months. The words can be identical. The outcome rarely is. On the ledger, a reserve built in the calm periods, which is what actually makes the hard periods survivable. Think of this as the account every other entry in this ledger draws from. A specific ask, a two-track response, a scheduled pause all work far better when they're being deployed inside a relationship that has real trust already banked, rather than one trying to build trust and resolve conflict at the exact same moment. Add it all up, and here's the full ledger. What this framework gives you: deflections caught before they build momentum, requests specific enough to be visible rather than vague enough to vanish, tone and substance handled as two separate tracks instead of one absorbing the other, pauses that lead back to resolution instead of away from it, ground rules banked in calm moments for use in hard ones, outside structure used before crisis instead of only after, a real threshold that protects your own patience, a standard you've demonstrated yourself before asking for it in return, and a reserve of goodwill that makes every hard conversation easier to actually survive. Now here's exactly how you use this the next time it comes up. First, the moment you notice the first deflection, name it in the same conversation, calmly. I notice we moved past that. I need us to actually stay with it. Second, always land on a specific ask before the conversation ends. If you can't state what you specifically need to happen next, the conversation isn't actually finished yet, no matter how it feels. Third, if tone becomes part of the conversation, handle it in one sentence and return to substance in the next one, out loud, so neither gets to stand in for the other. Fourth, if a pause is genuinely needed, set the return time before you separate, and hold to it as firmly as you'd hold to any other commitment either of you makes. Fifth, propose your standing ground rule in a calm moment this week, not in the middle of your next disagreement, so it's already agreed to before you ever need to invoke it. Sixth, consider counseling as a proactive tool rather than a last resort, especially if you've been applying all this consistently for months without real movement. And seventh, keep depositing into the relationship outside of conflict entirely. The system in this video works far better in a relationship with a real reserve of goodwill than in one running on empty. Build the reserve deliberately, and the hard conversations get easier by default. None of this guarantees a specific outcome, and it isn't supposed to. What it guarantees is that you're no longer just absorbing the pattern. You're running an actual system against it, one that puts the outcome where it belongs, on whether the issue itself actually gets addressed, not on how well you manage someone else's reaction to you raising it. So here's my question for you, and I want something specific in the comments. Which piece of this framework do you think would have changed the outcome the last time you lived through this? And are you going to try it the next time it comes up? This has been Robbin for The Honest Ledger, the channel that reads the fine print nobody hands you. If the last two videos named something you'd been living without words for, this is the part where we actually do something about it. Subscribe if you want the rest of the ledger opened up, one entry at a time.